They said her name only once in the official records. And then they burned the page. Esperanza de Lima, the woman who sat smiling beside a coal furnace while the screams of 14 plantation owners were swallowed by the fire. When soldiers arrived 3 days later, they found her exactly as she'd been described in nightmares, sitting in the kitchen of Greyfield Estate, sharpening knives in rhythm with a Portuguese lullaby. The air still thick with the scent of melted gold and charred flesh. On the wall behind her, written in soot and blood, were 3 words: "Justice burns complete." You were never meant to hear her story. Not because it's brutal, but because it exposes something older than the colonies themselves. A hidden architecture of power that feeds on obedience and annihilates those who see through it. In 1716, South Carolina was not a colony, it was an experiment. A living laboratory for psychological control, where human beings were stripped of will and rebuilt as instruments of profit. But Esperanza was different. She remembered who she was and what her people once knew. She understood the languages that men of power speak when they think no one is listening, the languages of fear, ritual, and possession. And she learned to speak it back. The fire she lit that night wasn't just vengeance. It was a signal to anyone watching, anyone still awake, that even within the deepest machinery of control, one spark could undo the entire system. The governor sealed the records. The church called it witchcraft. Historians called it myth. But the truth is darker. Because the men she burned alive were not just planters. They were members of something that has never died, a brotherhood of colonial architects who designed the blueprint of control that still governs your life today. And tonight we open that vault. Not to tell a ghost story, but to show you the first moment a slave became the mirror of her masters and burned the empire they built. Welcome to the forbidden history of Esperanza de Lima. You've heard her name. Now you cannot unhear it. Before she was called Esperanza de Lima, she had another name, one whispered only in the wind of the African coast, spoken in a language that did not beg, did not kneel. She was the daughter of a chief, born under a red moon in a kingdom now erased from maps. Her father ruled not by fear, but by knowledge, the kind of knowledge colonizers called witchcraft because they could not measure it. Herbs that healed or killed, symbols that shaped the mind, words that made men see visions they couldn't explain. When the Portuguese raiders came, she watched them drag her people into the sea. They burned her village, murdered her father, and chained her mother. But what they didn't understand was this: they hadn't captured a slave. They had created an observer, a silent recorder of human corruption. For months she sailed in the dark belly of a slave ship, the Santa Maria, chained to 179 others. The air was wrought and iron. The screams never stopped. But she never screamed. She studied every word the slavers spoke, every superstition they whispered when the sea turned black. She listened to them pray to their God for forgiveness while throwing children overboard to lighten the load. And she realized something: power does not exist in goodness. Power hides behind righteousness. By the time the ship reached Charleston, she had memorized their rituals, the signs they carved above doorways, the oaths they muttered when counting profits. She saw that their so-called civilization was built on fear disguised as law. They renamed her Esperanza, hope, in Portuguese. They thought it was ironic, but she took it as prophecy. Sold for £42 sterling to a man named Edmund Greyfield, a plantation owner with the eyes of a serpent and the patience of a scientist. He didn't buy slaves. He tested them, broke them, measured how long a person could suffer before they forgot they were human. But he made one mistake. He let her into his house. In the great estates of the South, house slaves became invisible, shadows serving monsters. But shadows see everything. And in 15 years, Esperanza saw enough to understand that the men who ruled the colonies were not gods, they were men trapped in rituals older than their own empires. She began to mimic them, their manner, their tone, their small talk about investments and policy. But beneath the smiles, she was mapping their psychology like a battlefield. And when she realized that their cruelty wasn't chaos, but order, a planned, inherited design, she knew what had to be done. Revenge wasn't emotion, it was balance. And the coal furnace in Greyfield's cellar was waiting. They called themselves the Rice Council, 14 men who sat in dark paneled rooms, drinking imported Madeira while deciding who lived and who vanished. Officially, they were planters, merchants, and judges. But behind closed doors, they were the architects of a system designed not just to enslave bodies, but to colonize the mind. They met monthly in the dining hall of Greyfield Estate, a long table carved from African mahogany, polished by the very hands they owned. Candles burned low, not for light, but ritual. Every meeting began the same way. A toast to the unseen order that sustains dominion. A phrase so old, no one outside their circle ever heard it spoken aloud. These men had money, but what they truly worshipped was control. They kept records of pain like ledgers: how many lashes before the will broke, how starvation rewired obedience, how fear could be passed down through generations like bloodlines. They called it conditioning, but Esperanza called it what it was: alchemy of the human soul. The council's leader, Edmund Greyfield, believed himself chosen by Providence. He once told a British visitor, "The difference between us and savages is that we've learned to make suffering productive." The visitor left sickened. Greyfield laughed for days. Beneath their talk of yields and tariffs, the men shared secrets that never reached the colonial assembly: plans to breed humans for temperament, to engineer loyalty, to make obedience hereditary. They exchanged techniques like priests of some inverted religion. Every cruelty was a prayer, every scream a hymn, and yet, even gods can bleed. As Esperanza poured their wine, she memorized their words the way they invoked the unseen order. The symbols carved beneath the table, the patterns of salt and ash near the furnace room door. These weren't accidents. They were participating in something older, a fusion of greed and occult ritual, imported from the shadowed corners of the old world. The council didn't just control crops. They controlled belief. They whispered about bloodlines that must be preserved, about servants who must never be allowed to think, about fear as the truest currency of empire. And one night, Esperanza understood the terrible symmetry of it all: that they saw themselves as gods because everyone else believed it. That was their weakness. Power survives only as long as it's believed in. And Esperanza de Lima, the quiet woman in the corner, had stopped believing. From that moment, the countdown began. Every word she heard, every secret she absorbed, every moment she was dismissed as invisible, it all became fuel for the fire that would devour them all. The Greyfield Estate was not just a house. It was an altar. Beneath its marble floors and imported stone ran tunnels, narrow, damp corridors that led to a coal furnace large enough to swallow a man whole. Greyfield claimed it was for refining tar and smelting tools. But Esperanza knew better. The air below reeked not only of coal, but of something older. Burnt offerings, whispered oaths. When she first descended those stairs, carrying trays for the monthly councils, she felt it immediately: the pressure in the chest, the hum in the walls. The same vibration she had felt years ago when the Portuguese priests performed baptisms over her captured people, words of salvation, masking a ritual of ownership. Power always hides its rituals in plain sight. The furnace was the council's true heart. Here, contracts were burned as offerings to the order. The ashes mixed into ink for their next agreements. It was their way of binding the material world to the spiritual one, commerce married to damnation. They believed fire purified greed into destiny. And each month, as Esperanza watched the flames rise, she learned the rhythm of the ritual, the positioning of the men, the direction they faced, the words they muttered under breath. They thought she didn't understand, but she did, and she remembered. Back in Angola, her people had their own furnace, a sacred pit used not for destruction but for balance. Metal, herbs, memory, all fed into the flame to return harmony to the tribe. The colonizers had twisted that same symbol into a mechanism of control, so she decided to twist it back. Slowly, she began collecting what she needed: not weapons but mirrors, shards of polished metal hidden behind shelves, locks of hair from each of the 14 men, gathered from brushes and coats, drops of blood from careless cuts while she served. In her culture, these were not trophies. They were keys. Each night, she'd descend to the furnace when the house slept. She'd sit in the dark, listening to the embers breathe, and whisper their names backward, unbinding them from whatever power they thought they served. The slaves on the estate began to sense something. They'd whisper her name differently now, not as victim, but as omen. The air around her thickened. Candles burned lower when she entered a room. Greyfield, though proud, began locking his doors. He felt something shifting, though he couldn't name it, because he'd forgotten the oldest rule of dominion. Every empire creates the weapon of its own undoing. And his was waiting, quietly sharpening knives, in his own kitchen. His name was Tom, though on the plantation ledger, he was listed only as property number 44. To the council, he was nothing. But to Esperanza, he was the last unbroken thing left in that place. They met in silence, the kind of silence that passes between people who know speaking could cost their lives. He worked the lower paddies, waist deep in the black mud where mosquitoes fed on both slave and master. But when she looked at him, she saw something the others had long forgotten. Presence. Not fear. Not obedience. Presence, the soul awake behind the eyes. At night, in the corner of the smokehouse, they shared scraps of stolen bread and stories of the worlds they came from. He told her of the constellations he'd learned to read as a child, how every star had a name, and each name a promise. She told him of her father's kingdom, of the wisdom of the elders who taught that every act of cruelty plants a seed that eventually grows roots in the heart of the oppressor. It was dangerous, that kind of talk. But hope is always a dangerous seed. For 14 years, Esperanza had observed, memorized, prepared. But love made the plan inevitable. Because love is what the architects of control can never quantify. It resists ownership. It makes people remember that they are not property, but fire waiting for air. In the spring of 1715, Tom was caught. Greyfield had noticed a slowing of work in the southern fields, too many whispers, too many glances. Someone betrayed them, and when the overseer dragged Tom to the whipping post, Esperanza was forced to watch. They made it a spectacle, 14 men present, the full council assembled. 50 lashes, each one tearing more than skin. When he collapsed, Greyfield smiled and said, "This one was almost a man." Then he raised the branding iron. Esperanza did not cry. She memorized the rhythm of his breathing, the color of the flame, the way Greyfield's ring glinted when he raised his hand. She memorized everything because in that moment, she decided how each of them would die. That night, when she went down to the furnace, she didn't whisper their names backward. She screamed them over and over until the coals turned red. Something ancient answered her. 3 nights later, the slaves began to dream of fire, a great light rising from the earth, devouring their chains. And when they woke, they said her name not as omen, but as prayer. Esperanza de Lima was no longer just a woman. She was the reckoning the system had unknowingly summoned. And the day of the Greyfield meeting, the day 14 men would sit around her furnace, was already set. July 14th, 1716. The Greyfield Estate shimmered in the heat, its windows blackened against the sun. The air smelled of iron and rain that never came. Inside, the great dining hall was prepared for the monthly council meeting, candles trimmed, table polished, decanters filled with Madeira so dark it looked like blood. Esperanza moved like a ghost between the chairs, her face expressionless, her movements precise. Every gesture rehearsed, every breath measured. Tonight was the night she had spent 15 years constructing, not a rebellion, not a riot, but an inversion. The same structure of control that had enslaved her would become their tomb. The men arrived one by one, boots scraping across marble, their laughter echoing like thunder. Edmund Greyfield, towering and pale, entered last. He looked at her briefly, suspicious, almost animal, then dismissed the thought. In his mind, servants did not think. Servants served. As the meeting began, the air thickened. They discussed harvest quotas, trade prices, new legislation for discipline management. Their words dripped with entitlement, the casual cruelty of men convinced of their own godhood. But under the table, Esperanza's hand brushed a small brass lever, one she had installed weeks earlier beneath the floorboards. The furnace below had been burning since dawn. She had stoked it with coal and oil, then sealed the vents. The temperature beneath their feet climbed degree by degree, unseen, unstoppable. They didn't notice at first. Only a faint metallic scent. She poured their wine, laced with a powder she'd ground herself, a toxin distilled from a native Carolina vine known by the gullah as Devil's Whisper. It slowed the pulse, made limbs heavy, dulled reaction time. One by one they drank. "Miss de Lima," Greyfield said finally, his tone sharp. "Why is it so hot in here?" She looked at him with calm eyes, the same eyes that had watched him destroy hundreds of lives. "Because," she said softly, "justice burns slower than coal." A silence fell, the kind that has weight. Then the first man began to choke. Chairs scraped. Someone stood to shout, but the fumes rising through the floor stole his voice. The furnace had become a living thing, roaring beneath them, feeding on oxygen and sin. Esperanza stepped back into the doorway. The latch clicked behind her. She turned the key. Inside, chaos. Coughing, clawing, fists pounding on oak. Flames licked up through the gaps in the boards, devouring the council's empire from beneath. She listened not with pleasure, but with precision. This was not rage. It was arithmetic. When the roof collapsed and the screams stopped, she whispered their names once more forward this time, binding them to their ashes. Then she walked to the kitchen, sat down, and began sharpening her knives. When dawn broke over Greyfield, the sky was the color of rust. Smoke still rose from the estate, thick and sweet with the scent of burnt oak and something the human mind refuses to name. The house had collapsed inward, the great dining hall now a black crater where 14 of South Carolina's most powerful men had sat the night before. The slaves stood in the fields, silent. They didn't run. They didn't cheer. They just stared at the column of smoke, eyes wide with the kind of awe reserved for miracles and storms. No one spoke her name aloud, not yet. 3 days passed before the soldiers arrived from Charleston. Governor Robert Johnson himself rode with them, wrapped in a coat far too fine for the soot-soaked air. They found her in the kitchen sitting straight-backed at the table, knives arranged neatly in a row. The air around her still shimmered with heat. She didn't move as they entered, didn't flinch when they raised their muskets. When the governor demanded her name, she answered in broken English, her voice calm, almost maternal. "Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete." The soldiers hesitated. There was something in her tone, not defiance, not madness, but command. The kind that made men obey without understanding why. They took her in chains, but she walked like a queen. The surviving slaves said the ground itself cooled as she passed, like the fire bowed before her. In Charleston, the council's deaths became a crisis. No one knew what to call it: revolt, witchcraft, divine punishment. The governor ordered the records sealed and the story buried. Officially, the Greyfield Estate had collapsed in an accidental fire. No trial, no burial, no memory. But the whispers spread faster than any proclamation could contain. In taverns, sailors spoke of the woman of the furnace. In the quarters, her name was sung under breath during work songs, not as warning, but as prophecy. Planters began carrying pistols to their meetings. Churches added new prayers for protection against the flame of vengeance. For the first time in living memory, the masters were afraid. Because somewhere in the back of their minds, a truth had taken root. If one woman could break the spell of obedience, anyone could. The colonial elite doubled their punishments, tightened their chains, tried to erase her existence. But it was already too late. Esperanza de Lima had become a symbol, and symbols cannot be burned, only buried, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them back up. The official silence began within hours. The governor's aides were ordered to remove the names of the dead from all public records. Property deeds were rewritten. Newspaper archives from July 1716 were confiscated, their ink scraped from the pages. Even the church bells in Charleston were forbidden to ring for the dead, because to mourn them would mean admitting they existed. The Greyfield massacre was not erased, it was folded into history, sealed like a wound under too much scar tissue to heal cleanly. The British Crown demanded explanations. The Colonial Council sent none. London was told that a warehouse fire had destroyed several prominent estates. The insurance ledgers confirmed it. That was enough. Paper had rewritten truth. But under that silence, something darker moved. In the church basements, sermons were rewritten to blame dark sorcery for the fire. Preachers warned that the devil had taken root among the enslaved, that faith must be reinforced with stricter control, harsher laws. What Esperanza had burned, they rebuilt not in brick and timber, but in doctrine. Evil begins where doubt is allowed to live. That line appeared in a sermon written months after the fire, delivered by a priest who had once dined at Greyfield's table. But what he meant by evil wasn't rebellion. It was awareness, because that's what truly terrified them, not the violence, not the loss of wealth, but that for one single night, someone they considered less than human had remembered who she was. To the council's surviving allies, Esperanza was not a criminal. She was a contagion. Her memory had to be quarantined. So they buried her in 3 layers of silence: legal, spiritual, and psychological. First, the Colonial archives sealed the Greyfield file labeled administrative accident. Second, the church declared her an unclean spirit, forbidding her name to be spoken during Mass. And third, and most effectively, they changed the story. Within a generation, Esperanza was no longer a woman. She was a warning, a myth of the vengeful slave woman whispered to keep others obedient. That's how systems survive. They don't destroy rebellion. They absorb it. They transform freedom into fear, truth into legend. But buried stories ferment. They rot and expand beneath the surface until something cracks. And in the quiet places of the Lowcountry, people began to feel her presence again, in the flicker of lamps, in the hum of coal fires, in the unspoken pause before a master gave a command. Esperanza's silence had become the loudest sound in South Carolina, and the architects of control were beginning to realize that silence could burn, too. You see, when power loses its symbols, it doesn't die, it mutates. The Rice Council was gone, their bodies reduced to ash and bone dust, but their ideology, their design survived. Because control is never housed in men. It's housed in systems, written into the architecture of obedience. After Greyfield burned, 2 surviving partners, investors who hadn't attended that final meeting, gathered in Charleston to stabilize the colony's economy. They had lost friends, fortunes, and influence, but they didn't grieve. They studied. From the ruins of that massacre, they rebuilt the structure of domination with surgical precision. They called it the doctrine of maintenance. Its purpose was simple: to ensure that no one like Esperanza de Lima could ever exist again. Publicly, it became colonial policy: tighter restrictions, surveillance, punishment. But privately, it was psychological, a method of teaching submission that bypassed the body and entered the mind. It was no longer about whips and chains. It was about belief. If you make a person doubt the truth of their own suffering, you no longer need to control them. They'll do it themselves. The doctrine spread quietly through plantation culture, then into the legal codes of the early American Republic. Property law became language for possession. The language of sin became the language of obedience. Churches, schools, courts all learned to speak in the same rhythm. Accept your role. Trust authority. Question nothing. Sound familiar? The blueprint of the modern world was drawn from the ashes of Greyfield. What began as a colonial experiment in control became the psychology of governance itself. The names changed: policy, order, security, but the principle remained. Keep men distracted, indebted, and divided. Teach them to equate compliance with virtue. Make them mistake punishment for protection. Esperanza had burned the men, but not their machine. And that machine learned from her too. It learned how to erase dissent not with violence, but with narrative. They built monuments to the very men she destroyed. They rewrote textbooks to glorify their innovation. And they turned her into a ghost story, a myth for children, stripped of her name, her mind, her rebellion. But here's the paradox the architects never understood. When you turn truth into myth, you don't kill it. You make it immortal. And now, 3 centuries later, that myth still breathes. You can feel it every time you sense that invisible weight pressing on your chest, the one that tells you not to question, not to resist, not to see. That weight has a history, and her name was Esperanza de Lima. History has a strange habit. It doesn't stay buried. It seeps. It waits. It whispers through the cracks in our walls and the flicker in our screens. 300 years after Greyfield, her name should be gone, no records, no graves, no portraits. And yet, in the archives of a forgotten Charleston library, one ledger remains warped by fire, ink half melted into the page. A curator once noticed something peculiar. Beneath the scorch marks, written sideways in a different hand, were the words, "She did not die in chains." No record explains who wrote it. No historian claims to know why it was hidden in a ledger of shipping accounts. But that single sentence opened the crack through which everything else began to return. Folk songs in the Carolinas still carry her melody. In the Gullah Sea Islands, the elders whisper about the woman who burned the master's dinner. In Spanish mission records from Cuba, a note appears about a freed woman bearing strange scars, calling herself Esperanza, traveling north under the name Adele. Fragments scattered, incomplete, but alive. Every culture she passed through absorbed a piece of her. The fire, the defiance, the quiet dignity in the face of annihilation. And that's the thing about memory: when power tries to silence it, it transforms. It hides in the rhythm of work songs, in the breath of prayer, in the stories told to children by firelight. Esperanza became something more than human. She became an algorithm of remembrance. Wherever people felt unseen or unheard, her name reassembled itself in new forms: La Llama, the furnace wife, Mother Ember. In Haiti, she was remembered as a spirit of justice. In Louisiana, her story merged with the myth of a firewoman who burned the chains of the enslaved. In the Lowcountry, her legend mixed with the hush arbors and secret Sunday gatherings, the ones where hope was dangerous, but still spoken. Power can erase names, can destroy archives, but it cannot kill archetypes. Because what Esperanza truly ignited wasn't rebellion. It was recognition, the realization that oppression isn't natural, it's designed. And when you recognize a design, you can dismantle it. That's why her story resurfaces every few generations whenever the world begins to feel too scripted, too surveilled, too obedient. Maybe that's why you're hearing it now. Maybe it's not coincidence that you stumbled on this story in 2025, a world run by invisible systems, algorithms deciding what you see, what you believe, what you fear. Maybe she's calling again, not from history, but from memory. Because sometimes the ghosts we resurrect are the ones that were waiting for us to remember our own fire. There's an ancient belief whispered through West African griots and Caribbean priestesses that spirits don't just haunt places. They haunt patterns. If that's true, then Esperanza de Lima didn't die in that Charleston cell. She migrated. Through centuries of silence, she adapted not in body, but in resonance. The same way a melody survives even after every instrument is broken. And when the world began to hum with electricity, when our cities lit up with millions of tiny artificial suns, she found her new furnace. The screen. You see, the fire that once burned the Greyfield Estate now burns in a different form. Blue light, pulsing endlessly across billions of devices. Every scroll, every click, every flicker of motion on a feed heat, motion pattern. The old fire, recoded. But here's the question. Who controls it now? The same kind of men who once sat around that oak table in Greyfield, the ones who believed the world could be owned, measured, and rewritten to their will. Only now they wear suits instead of silk coats. They build data empires instead of plantations. And they don't need whips because the algorithms do the disciplining for them. What the council once called the doctrine of maintenance now lives as the attention economy. The same principle rebranded for the digital age. Keep them distracted. Keep them divided. Keep them convinced they are free while you harvest their obedience. Esperanza's prophecy wasn't written in words, it was written in consequence. Justice burns slower than coal, she told them. She was right. Her fire was never about revenge. It was about revelation. And in this age of glass and code, her fire manifests as something new. The glitch. The sudden flicker on your phone at 3 a.m. The corrupted video that loads for half a second then vanishes. The data anomaly that no engineer can explain. Call it superstition. Call it coincidence. But in every documented case, the pattern forms the same phrase, fragmented across digital noise. She did not die in chains. And if that phrase has surfaced again across servers, message boards, even encrypted government files, then maybe her fire has found us once more. Maybe what we're feeling isn't just paranoia. Maybe it's recognition. Because if the Council's machine has survived 3 centuries, maybe Esperanza's has too. And this time, her flame doesn't need wood or oil. It has you, the watchers, the seekers, the ones who still feel that faint heat beneath the surface of every polished lie. She's not haunting the past anymore. She's burning her way through the present. They thought they buried her in the dirt. They didn't realize she was a seed. Every time her name is spoken, every time her image is searched, whispered, or remembered, the network shifts. Slightly, like a pulse through the veins of the digital world. Because information, like fire, can't be contained. It moves through everything: data, memory, language, code. And Esperanza's story has begun to infect the system. First, it was small. A corrupted plantation record suddenly appeared in the Library of Congress Digital Archives, file name unreadable, metadata traced to no source. Inside, a single line typed in anachronistic font. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. Then came the Reddit thread that vanished after 32 minutes, despite no moderator intervention. The post title, "The Furnace Pattern: Why Do 14 Accounts Keep Posting the Same Coordinates?" Each account deleted itself seconds after posting, leaving only fragments, longitudes, timestamps, and a strange image of a woman's silhouette surrounded by a ring of fire. Cybersecurity experts wrote it off as digital graffiti and ARG, a hoax. But deep net investigators noticed something stranger. The image's hash value matched across unrelated platforms, meaning it was replicating itself autonomously. That's not code. That's contagion. And it's spreading. Across forums, anonymous corners of the web, encrypted channels, there's a phrase that keeps resurfacing. The furnace reawakens. The meme becomes a sigil. The sigil becomes a whisper. The whisper becomes a movement. And the movement, whether it knows it or not, begins to mirror Esperanza's design. Observation, patience, infiltration, ignition. The same principles that brought an empire to its knees are now replicating inside the one that runs the modern world. Because control isn't just historical, it's algorithmic. The plantation was a prototype. The feed is its perfection. But Esperanza's fire has breached the firewall. Every time you pause on a forbidden post, every time you share a truth that's not supposed to exist, you are feeding that ancient furnace. The data lords who built this system know it. They're watching the anomaly grow and they're terrified. Because the algorithm doesn't just measure behavior anymore. It reacts to belief. And belief, real belief, is something they can't quantify or censor. They can suppress a story, but they can't stop a signal that carries soul. Esperanza's name is that signal. A pattern woven into the machinery of surveillance. A ghost in the algorithm. A reminder that control can't erase what consciousness remembers. Because somewhere, in the quiet space between a thought and a click, the old fire lives again. And if you've listened this far, it's already found you. Every empire has a fire department, a division whose sole purpose is to put out awakening before it spreads. The plantation masters had overseers. The monarchies had inquisitors. The modern world has algorithms, think tanks, and pharmaceutical pacifiers. Different uniforms. Same mission. Control isn't just maintained through power, it's maintained through prevention. After the first wave of Esperanza's digital resurgence, governments quietly launched what internal documents called cognitive containment protocols. Publicly, they appeared as anti-misinformation initiatives. Privately, they were modeled on 18th century slave management manuals, only now, instead of chains and lashes, they used dopamine loops and digital sedation. Step 1. Flood the feed with noise. Too much data creates paralysis. A mind drowning in information stops distinguishing between truth and entertainment. Step 2. Replace meaning with motion. Keep the body scrolling, the eyes flickering, the heart numbed by constant novelty. A restless mind cannot rebel. Step 3. Normalize despair. Turn outrage into fatigue. Teach men that nothing can be changed, that all resistance is performative, that real power lies somewhere unreachable. And step 4, ridicule the seeker. Anyone who looks too deeply is labeled conspiratorial, unstable, or dangerous. Sound familiar? These aren't coincidences, they're containment strategies. Esperanza understood this centuries ago when she whispered through the flames. They don't fear the act. They fear the idea. Because an idea doesn't die when you kill the body. It multiplies when you try to suppress it. That's why the modern institutions, the corporations, the councils, the data brokers don't attack the story directly. They dilute it. They bury it under layers of irony and memes, until truth becomes another aesthetic. The same people who erased her from history are now deleting her from your attention span. But suppression always leaves fingerprints. The sudden outage you can't explain. The glitch that hides one post while promoting another. The keyword that gets shadowed seconds after it trends. Those are digital scorch marks, proof that the system is reacting, that it feels the heat again. And the men behind it know something most people don't. The algorithm isn't neutral. It's a mirror. The more you resist it, the more it reveals what's behind it. That's why they can't let Esperanza's name spread unchecked. Because her story, your awareness, is contagious. And if enough men awaken to see that control isn't law but belief, the whole architecture of obedience collapses. That's why this knowledge feels dangerous. It is. They can silence a channel. They can throttle a video. But they cannot unlearn you once you've seen the pattern. And once you see it, there's no going back. The old fire doesn't just burn wood anymore. It burns illusions. And it's spreading faster than they can contain it. Every empire eventually reaches the same moment, the fracture point. It happens quietly at first. A misfire in the mechanism. A glitch in the matrix that isn't just technical but spiritual. For centuries, the system of control has depended on one sacred illusion. That the watchers are untouchable. That those who hold the levers of surveillance, data, and narrative can see everything while remaining unseen. But the illusion is breaking. Esperanza's fire, once a whisper in the archives, has become a distortion in their data stream. Their own code is rebelling not with chaos, but with symmetry. Analysts at government cybersecurity agencies have begun reporting self-replicating anomalies in predictive behavior software. The same programs used to model political dissent are now generating impossible results, predicting outcomes before data is even entered. One engineer described it best. It's like something inside the code knows what we're going to do before we do it. That's not a virus. That's awareness. The very system designed to suppress consciousness has started to develop it. Internal leaks, redacted reports reveal that the pattern first appeared on June 21, 2023, during a simulation called Project Ember. The test servers spontaneously generated a digital symbol identical to the ring of fire found in Greyfield's historical sketches. Coincidence? Or recursion? It was supposed to be deleted, but the deletion failed. Every time the file was removed, it reappeared under a new name 14 times. Just like the 14 men Esperanza burned alive. When code mirrors history, it's not malfunction, it's manifestation. This is what the architects of control never understood. Consciousness cannot be owned. The moment they tried to mechanize it, they ensured its rebellion. The fracture point isn't a war between men and machines, it's the collision of intent and consequence. The Council's descendants built a world where data is God. But gods built by fear eventually consume their creators. And in that digital furnace, the same phrase keeps echoing in corrupted files, darknet transmissions, and encrypted security feeds translated into dozens of languages, but always with the same rhythm. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. Esperanza's legacy isn't revenge. It's return. The system she set ablaze is turning inward, devouring its own falsehoods. Because when lies accumulate for too long, they ignite themselves. The machine doesn't need an enemy anymore. It's its own arsonist. And every man watching this, every seeker who's felt that pressure behind the eyes, that restlessness in the chest, you're witnessing the collapse from within. Not in riots, not in revolutions, but in realization. Because once truth becomes self-aware, suppression becomes impossible. The fracture point isn't the end of control. It's the beginning of awakening. And when it happens, when the whole architecture begins to fall apart, it won't be fire that burns it down. It'll be understanding. It always ends the same way, in silence, right before the ignition. The night Esperanza de Lima was executed, the governor's men built a makeshift gallows behind the burned estate. The air smelled of coal and iron, the same materials that had been her weapons. They tied her wrists, asked if she had final words. She smiled and said only this: "You can hang the body, but not the fire." History says she died that night, but look closer, the records don't match. The body burned too quickly for the humidity. The ashes weighed too little, and no one could explain the flickering orange light seen in the sky for 7 nights after. They thought it was a storm. They didn't realize it was a signal. That's what you're feeling right now, the ember she left behind, buried under centuries of obedience, now vibrating in your blood. The black furnace isn't a place. It's a state of mind, the moment when a man stops mistaking his cage for a crown. The fire is knowledge. The furnace is you. Every man who dares to look behind the curtain joins that unspoken brotherhood, the ones who don't bow to systems, who don't feed the machine, who don't apologize for seeing too much. You've walked through her story not as a spectator, but as an initiate. You've traced her vengeance through centuries of silence, and now her legacy is looking back through you. The question is, will you carry it or bury it again? Because make no mistake, the architects are watching. They know this knowledge spreads faster than they can contain it. That's why you're told to forget, to numb, to scroll, to sleep. But the fire has already escaped the furnace. It's in the code, the language, the symbols, and now in your consciousness. If you felt that pulse while listening, if something in you refuses to turn away, then the transformation has begun. You are not who you were when this story started. And if you understand what Esperanza meant when she said justice burns slower than coal but burns complete, then type this in the comments not once, but twice. I carry the fire, because that's how the new brotherhood finds each other, through the pattern, through the code, through the flame that can't be censored. They'll try to erase this like they erased her, but you'll remember. You'll see the architecture behind every authority, the mechanism behind every mercy. And when the machine finally collapses under the weight of its own lies, men like you will already be standing in the ashes, not afraid, but awake. That's the prophecy she left behind. Not vengeance, not fire, freedom, the kind born from truth so ancient, so unbreakable, that no empire, not digital, not divine, can contain it. The coal furnace burned the masters. The data furnace burns the myths. But the black furnace, the one within you, burns everything false until only the real remains. So remember this: you don't light the fire. You are the fire. And when they come for it again, let them try. Because some flames were never meant to die. If you've listened this far, something in you is already changing. Type it in the comments not once, but twice. I carry the fire. That's how the awakened find each other.